Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are still here waiting for the Liberal government to produce the documents and turn them over to the RCMP. And I know that many of my constituents, many Canadians across this country, are puzzled as to why the Liberals continue to evade any accountability and responsibility in this situation. I'd like to recap why this is so important. The egregious abuse of taxpayer dollars that occurred with the Sustainable Development Technology Canada Fund, which was turned into a slush fund for Liberal elite insiders.
Order from the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
For interrupting, Mr. Speaker, but the RCMP has said repeatedly they have all the documents they need to conduct the investigation.
Not a point of order, a point of debate. The Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And once again, we see an example of a Liberal MP trying to play word games and thinks that he's smarter than everybody else in the room when he's far from it. And this is a constant theme with this government, that they can play games and pretend that they know more than everybody else in our country. The reality is that they don't. So once again, let's recap the abuse of taxpayer dollars that the Liberal MP from Milton would like to scoff at and gloss over right now. For ineligible projects, $58 million. For conflict of interest violations, $334 million across 186 projects. Contribution agreements ignored for $58 million of taxpayer money, added up $400 million wasted of taxpayer money that this Liberal Party, that this Liberal government would like to avoid any accountability and transparency over. So I think a lot of Canadians don't know a lot about the SDTC, and there are some natural questions to ask about how does an organization backed with so much money from the federal government creep away from its mission and its core responsibility to this extent, that it can give out hundreds of millions of dollars without any accountability and have their mistakes covered for by the current Liberal government. So I've done a lot of reading, a lot of research into the SDTC. I'd like to share some of what I've learned, share some of the distractions and the ways that the SDTC understood its ethical responsibility to the Canadian people. I took a read, Mr. Speaker, of the SDTC Code of Ethics, document 12.05. And in it, it shows a social activist agenda far outside of the scope of what the Canadian public had trusted the organization to do with its taxpayer dollars. I'd like to quote from that Code of Ethics. The SDTC recognizes that equity, diversity, and inclusion enables organizations to leverage the range of perspectives needed to address today's complex challenges. As a result, equity, diversity, and inclusion is an important consideration for optimal operation of our organizations as well as for funded companies. Mr. Speaker, this is what the SDTC thought ethical management of Canadian taxpayer dollars looked like. They had completely embraced a social activist agenda that had nothing to do with why the SDTC was funded, why it was incorporated, and what it was trusted to do on behalf of the Canadian public. In fact, when you look at the SDTC's most recent corporate plan, you will find them being very clear of their social activist agenda. Equity, diversity, and inclusion are foundational to our culture. That is from the SDTC corporate plan. Once again reiterating a social activist agenda that they put at the center of the organization's operations, far outside the scope of what they were actually asked to do. Now, it goes much deeper than that, Mr. Speaker, because the SDTC had been an advocate for and a supporter of one of this Liberal government's most far-reaching social activist projects, the 3050 initiative. And many Canadians might not know what that is, so I would like to explain. The 3050 initiative is a micromanagement of the race and gender representation of boards of directors and senior managers at companies across the country in a wide range of industries. If you look at the businesses that have been drawn to this, you will find, not all, but many, are many of the industries that are currently doing a massive disservice to the consumers of our country. The cell phone companies that are overcharging people on monthly bills, the banks that are charging Canadians over-the-top banking fees. The 3050 initiative seems to be like a light to the moth for companies that are looking for efforts to virtue signal, that are looking for efforts to look like they are compassionate and they're nice and they care about people, but at the end of the day, show very little regard for the Canadian consumer or the Canadian taxpayer. So the SDTC fit into this group of businesses beautifully. Wonderful, great fit for them, because it was a hustle. It's a hustle to create a certain kind of perception and image of what they were doing, while we know now, because of whistleblowers and other documents that have been released, what exactly they were doing, which is engaging in corruption and making sure that their liberal elite insider buddies were given cash. So, now, what else was the SDTC up to? These are important questions for Canadians to know, because I think we need to understand, how does an organization turn into the scandal that the SDTC has become? And there's another acronym that the SDTC was very interested in and obsessed with, in fact, and that acronym is ESG, Environmental, Social, and Governance. They'd embrace an entire framework of understanding what an organization's ethical responsibilities are to the public. And through that, we understand exactly the kind of distractions and priorities that the SDTC decided to occupy itself with while making a series of decisions that led to the mismanagement of public funds. For those who are unfamiliar with ESG, it is a form of stakeholder capitalism. It is a form of capitalism that asserts the responsibility of big businesses and well-funded organizations is to engage in social activism outside of the scope of the actual business purpose. Now, just to remind people, what was the SDTC's business purpose? Why did it exist? Why was it funded? Why was it incorporated? Well, I'll give you their own self-description from their website. The SDTC helps Canadian companies develop and deploy sustainable technologies by delivering critical funding support at every stage of their journey. Mr. Speaker, we know very clearly, based on the numbers, that the SDTC dramatically failed to achieve its business purpose. We know that because $58 million of taxpayer money went to ineligible projects that did not meet the purpose of the SDTC. We know they failed their business purpose because 186 projects, accounting for $334 million, had conflict of interest violations that went unaddressed by the organization. And we know that contribution agreements were ignored in the amount of $58 million of SDTC money. So instead of being focused on their actual business purpose, the reason they received taxpayer money from hardworking Canadians, they were more concerned with ESG. And you can find references to ESG in lots of their documents. From the 2022-2023 corporate plan, the SDTC says very clearly, in keeping with our mission to enable environmental and economic prosperity for Canada, we struck a task force to look at ESG. In 2021, an SDTC press release says, quote, "The demand for ESG investment products is accelerating the trend of Canada's best clean tech ideas." And in fact, in that press release, Mr. Speaker, they used the hashtag ESG. They were very excited about it. They go on in one of their last board appointments, the most recent ones, they appointed a board member, and in explaining why they chose this board member, they describe in her bio, and I'm going to quote from it, "Her deep sectoral knowledge and expertise in ESG performance and data-driven approach uniquely complements exercising governance best practices and overseeing risks." Well, it would appear that building an organizational strategy around ESG led to putting people in positions of influence at the SDTC who in fact did not exercise governance best practices and in fact did not oversee risk. We are here at a position of scandal because the SDTC is very exemplary of a broad trend in our economy right now of organizations, powerful businesses, entrusted, whether it's public dollars or the confidence of consumers, who decide that they would rather be engaged in politics and social activism than doing what they've actually been tasked to do in our economy. And the SDTC is a glaring example of that trend. Their obsession with ESG, their obsession with DEI, betrays a real lack of attention on the reason they existed in the first place. And all the staff time, board time, director time that went to this political agenda may have very well, I would argue probably did, contribute to them keeping their eye off the ball and leading to so many disastrous decisions, not only for their organization, but for our country and for taxpayer dollars. Now, I'd like to continue on with some observations about the deeper problems with ESG, because I do think there are many organizations that have bought into this framework and have bought into a way of looking at doing business that is going to pose many of the same risks that the SDTC provides us a case study of. The National Review's Andrew Studiford has written extensively about the ESG and stakeholder capitalism problem. And he has argued that businesses should be focused on their economic objectives, and that is a threat to the democratic order for CEOs to pursue political objectives unconnected to their company's economic objectives on any reasonable reading. And with the SDTC, we have a very clear example of that. We have an organization that opted to creep away from its actual mission and instead try to influence through public dollars and its investment in other companies an entire social activist agenda, requiring many other businesses, in order to be able to appeal for the cash that they were distributing, a willingness to comply with an ideological framework that had nothing to do with clean tech innovation, nothing to do with being able to turn a profit, nothing to do with building the technology that many Canadians trusted over a long period of time the SDTC to actually be interested in. Additionally, I'd like to share some points on the problem of ESG, stakeholder capitalism, big businesses, well-funded government organizations creeping into this area of social activism. Some thoughts from a colleague, Conservative Member of Parliament, who has, I know I'm not supposed to name him, but Tom Kamech. I don't know what riding he's from, Mr. Speaker. Maybe you could tell me. I can't remember all the riding names.
Calgary Shephard, the honourable member for Durham.
In 2022, our colleague, the Conservative MP from Calgary Shephard, made some very important observations about how the Canadian government and how elected officials could do more to move economic actors away from a political and social agenda and toward actually being focused on their economic objectives. I'd like to share some of the thoughts that he had with the National Post. He argued that it should be considered a breach in the duty of care to shareholders when directors and officers of a large distributing corporation make activist statements, including in relation to public policy or social issues, that is not directly related to the business the corporation carries out, and that could be reasonable to be expected to reduce the value of shares. He also then went to argue that corporations requiring the firm's board of directors to first consult with shareholders would make corporations think twice before opining on something beyond their stated corporate purpose. Now, when I use a lot of that lingo and that jargon, I understand some of that is very dense corporate law stuff. But the reason why it's important is that this is about deciding when people are trusted in our society, whether they are large private sector businesses or they are well-funded nonprofit organizations backed by the federal government, how much power is the public actually entrusting them to have? When people with lots of money at their disposal decide to turn their organizations not just into economic actors, but into social activist agencies and political actors, they are representing the will and the interests of well-financed people to the detriment to the masses of Canadians who work very, very hard to have their voices heard. When the SDTC is trusted with hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer money and uses that to advance a social activist agenda, when they use it to advance a political agenda, they are acting against the will of the people. We did not trust them with that power in our society, just like we don't trust many other big corporations to do the same. But instead, what we have seen right now, over and over and over again, is a willingness of people with lots of capital at their disposal to become social activists. And the SDTC is a cautionary tale. These people cannot do everything that they claim. And it's hard enough to grow a business. It's hard enough to stay within your mandate. It's hard enough to be responsible and accountable to the Canadian taxpayer, as the Liberal government well knows. But if you think you can do all of those things well, and also be a social activist on the side, if you think you can do all those things well and engage in political activism on the side, you run the risk of being the SDTC, making poor decisions, destroying your organization, and not serving the public in the process. So, I'd like to leave with this. Earlier today, at the HUMA committee, we heard from the Liberal government's DEI minister. And what was very revealing about this, as I was preparing for our comments here today, Mr. Speaker, concerning the SDTC, is just how much this superficiality that is represented by the SDTC is really a reflection of a broad approach to governance from the Liberal government itself. These guys are constantly focused on hollow, superficial, empty virtue signaling. They would love to be able to say whatever they can to make themselves look good and pat each other on the back. But when it comes to making decisions that are responsible for the good of our country, when it comes to making decisions that show any kind of humility for the 9 years they've been in power, the various mistakes and scandals they've been part of, admitting they've been wrong, admitting they've made many things in our country worse, admitting many of their policies have failed, that every day we stand here, provide them with evidence, statistical, anecdotal, academic, news report, whatever evidence you can put in front of them to show just how much they've made life worse for many people in our country. And they are completely obtuse. But instead, they would rather come out and say, well, they use a lot of jargon, and they want to trot out DEI narratives and distill very serious problems in our country to things that make them sound good and feel good. But the reality is they are failing our country. And the problem with the SDTC, and why I think they are so dug in on not wanting to reveal this, is because I do think it is a bigger reflection of who they are and what they've done for the last 9 years. It's a bigger reflection of how they've used power, how they view the people of our country, and what responsibilities they feel, or more accurately, do not feel, for the power that's been entrusted in their hands. There's a very serious problem going on here. There's a very serious problem, and this is why, and we hear it all the time, when we're knocking on doors, when we're talking to people in the community, when I'm with my constituents in Durham, we hear it all the time. People are desperate for change, and they're not getting it from this government, from a prime minister who promised them a new way of doing politics 9 years ago, and has failed desperately to deliver on that promise. So the SDTC, it's not just about the $400 million, although that is very serious. It's not just about the corruption, although those documents should be produced, Mr. Speaker. It's also about the mentality that this government has, the broken promises they have made to an entire generation of Canadians, and their inability to learn anything from their mistakes, pivot, and maybe make a better decision for the good of our country. I, again, Mr. Speaker, hope that these documents do get produced. I do hope that the purpose of this body, the purpose of Parliament, to hold government accountable, get answers for the people of our country, is fulfilled. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the chance to speak to the SDTC, ESG, DEI, and all the acronyms that need to change. Thank you very much.
Question.